The oldest, strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. But it's kind of strange because that fear of the unknown now has a face. And the poster child of that fear is Cthulhu. Almost everyone has heard of it. But when you step back and actually look at what it is, it's way deeper than most people realize. Lovecraft never even defined it, and it spiraled into something way beyond him. Other writers expanded it, and it somehow spread into everything from Bloodborne to tabletop RPGs, South Park, and yes, even anime girls. So today, we're diving into what Cthulhu actually is, how it formed, how it went mainstream, and of course the very complicated man behind it all. So try to ignore the chanting from your basement, block out the whispers in your dreams, and let's explore the terrifying history of Cthulhu. Hello everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examines. In this channel, we'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and as always, I want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons who keep this channel alive. Thank you. The Cthulhu Mythos, from the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, is equal parts terrifying, indescribable, and frankly, very confusing on a few several levels. Now, yes, at this point, everyone knows the basics, and I'm guessing you, as a smart, well-read human, do as well. But at its heart, Cthulhu is about cosmic horror, the fear of the unknown and the unknowable. The horror comes from realizing that reality itself is fragile, humans are insignificant, and there are beings and forces far beyond our limited, puny human understanding. But before we go any further, it's worth clarifying that this video will be on Cthulhu specifically, not Lovecraft's entire body of work. The two overlap, sure, but they aren't necessarily the same thing, although the lines can get blurred, especially because it's all essentially a shared universe. And that's where things start to get messy. Cthulhu grew way beyond anything Lovecraft probably ever intended. In fact, he didn't even come up with the term. Lovecraft himself never made his universe consistent or clearly defined, probably because the whole point of his writing was that, it defies explanation. But despite all of that, or maybe because of it, Cthulhu evolved into one of the most influential settings in all of horror, which is kind of funny because if you actually sit down and look at the lore, it's kind of insane on surface level. Alright, so let's hit the basic beats of what makes Cthulhu Cthulhu, all of which might be mildly bad news to all you humans out there. Starting with Number 1, the universe does not care about you. Humanity is irrelevant, a speck of dust in an infinite void. Number 2, the reason humans are irrelevant is because there are entities and forces much larger, more powerful, and more relevant out there, described as, quote, wholly beyond the utmost reach of any human imagination, end quote, whose very forms are incompatible with our sanity. Finally, number 3, some of these beings once ruled Earth before falling into a deep sleep. And one day they'll probably wake up. Best case scenario, humanity goes completely insane. Worst case, probably something way more terrifying and incomprehensible than we can even imagine, which, let's be honest, is probably the more likely of the two. And the poster child for this whole pantheon of indescribable cosmic beings is of course Cthulhu himself. But here's the strange part. Lovecraft never meant for his stories to form some neat, cohesive myth like the Greek gods or anything like that. In fact, like we talked about, his creatures were never even meant to be understood. They're not really forces of nature so much as forces of unnature. Things that exist completely outside the rules of our reality, which puts me in a kind of weird position because I'm supposed to explain to you what Cthulhu is, but by definition, that's impossible. Still, I'll try my best, and luckily, also kind of ironically, we actually know quite a bit about Cthulhu. Well, sort of. Quote, "The thing cannot be described. There was no language for such abysms of shrieking and immoral lunacy. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, a pulpy tentacle head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole thing which made it most shockingly frightful. End quote. Another account calls Cthulhu a, quote, gelatinous green immensity, which honestly I find at least mildly hilarious. I mean, if I heard someone describe that way, I'd probably chuckle at least, but apparently it's not so funny if you actually see him, because you can literally die of fright just by looking at him, presumably because your mind just can't even understand what it's looking at. Now, I can already feel deep in my soul someone furiously typing in the comments about my pronunciation of Cthulhu, probably saying that I'm not saying it correctly. But honestly, even Lovecraft couldn't, admitting that humans couldn't truly say it because it's just too alien. Anyway, for sanity's sake, I'm going to pronounce it the way that most people on the planet Earth say, Cthulhu. So, what is this gelatinous guy's deal anyway? Well, according to the lore, Cthulhu came to Earth in the distant past, long before humans existed, and built a city in the Pacific. It was made of this strange green stone with impossible geometry, but eventually a massive cataclysm sank it and Cthulhu way beneath the ocean, trapping him there in a death-like slumber. But sleeping for him doesn't really mean what it would for us. His dreams still echo across the world, infecting human minds. And yeah, that brings us to Cthulhu's fan club. Scattered across the globe, they hear his voice in dreams and patiently wait for Cthulhu to wake up or actively try to wake him up. With their favorite chant is, "In his house at Raleigh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." And quick tip, next time your boss asks you about deadlines or your partner reminds you to take out the trash, just start chanting that and it's guaranteed to make them go away. Now, Lovecraft wrote about sounds that could drive people insane. The whispers of cosmic gods, the chanting of ancient cults, and do you know what the best way to hear the whispering of Cthulhu's insanity-driving messages is? That's right, Raycon earbuds, baby. Now, in case you couldn't tell, this message and this video are sponsored by Raycon, which I'm genuinely happy to be partnering with, because you can bet the titan of horror himself would probably be rocking these bad boys. And it's no wonder why. These have been my go-to lately. They sound great, they're comfortable, and they actually stay in no matter what I'm doing. Whether I'm editing, listening to Lovecraft audiobooks, or just trying to drown out the chanting of the Cthulhu cult next door when I'm trying to sleep. The everyday earbuds are great with active noise cancellation, multi-point connectivity so I can pair them with 2 devices at once, and a really nice fit that doesn't budge. It also has a really nice quick charge that gives you 90 minutes of playtime in just 10 minutes and up to 32 hours of battery life, as well as an awareness mode, which I use when I'm out walking so I can actually hear what's going on around me. Now, one of the best things about them is that they're super affordable, and even more affordable right now. In fact, they gave me a great deal where you get up to 30% off just in time for Black Friday, which is honestly a steal. Or you could just click the link in the description to save on some great headphones and support the channel. Thank you, Raycon, for helping me drown out the whispers from beyond. Anyway, the interesting thing about Cthulhu is that he's not even the most interesting or even unique thing Lovecraft even created. In fact, this towering squid dragon is just a priest serving higher powers, beings so immense and alien that Cthulhu himself is basically middle management in the cosmic horror hierarchy. Now, if you ever looked into Lovecraft's world, you've probably seen names thrown around like Great Old Ones, Outer Gods, Elder Things, or Deep Ones. And yes, they're all technically different things, but only kind of. Now, Lovecraft himself never really explained the distinctions. He used the terms interchangeably, and any sort of clear cosmic ranking came way later from fans and other writers trying to make sense of the chaos. Now, I suspect Lovecraft himself probably wouldn't really approve of that because after all of this kind of defies human explanation and understanding. But despite all of that, let's run through a few of the other interesting beings in here, a smorgasbord of cosmic horror, if you will. and some of these are truly fascinating. We got Azathoth, the blind idiot god, described as, quote, where no dreams reach, that last amorphous blight of nethermost confusion which blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. The boundless demon sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare to speak aloud, who gnaws hungrily in inconceivable unlighted chambers beyond time amidst the muffled, maddening beats of vile drums and the thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes. End quote. Which is terrifying, right? Then there's Yog-Sothoth, which pretty much sums up the whole vibe. A god that knows everything and exists across all time and space, but somehow sits outside our universe. And this is what I mean, where every one of these cosmic beings is fascinating in its own twisted way. Now, most of these beings barely notice humans, but it would probably be way more terrifying if they actually did. Nyarlathotep. He shifts form, sometimes even human, to meddle in mortal affairs. And in fact, he was actually once worshipped as a pharaoh in ancient Egypt, and in one anime, he's a schoolgirl because sure, why not? Now, there are so many fascinating and terrifying things to mention in here, from things like the Migo, as well as the Deep Ones, who occasionally mate with humans, and don't try to think about that too hard. There's actually a whole pecking order here, kind of like cosmic schoolyard drama, if you will. They're not some unified force. In fact, in the story At the Mountains of Madness, Lovecraft even described Earth as a battleground for these ancient races, waging wars long before humans existed. The Old Ones built vast undersea empires, only to be pushed back by species descended from Cthulhu. Basically, Earth's history is one long alien turf war. And once you start digging into it, you realize that there is a whole ton of world building going on here. Now, you've got real places like Arizona and New England, but sprinkled in are fictional cities like Arkham, which have become hugely important and pop up across multiple stories. And on top of this are truly cosmic settings, the Dreamlands or the Nameless City. Or even things like the Necronomicon, an in-universe book written by the Mad Era that has its own lore and history, and that's exactly my point. Each of these concepts in Lovecraft's work is basically a whole world of lore unto its own. Everything feels faintly connected, but it never feels concrete, but rather very dreamlike. But beyond the geography, what really ties everything all together are the reoccurring concepts and themes. And we've touched on a lot of these already. Forbidden knowledge, fragile reality, and the futility of humankind to even fathom anything beyond its own very narrow confines. And if we can, by some miracle, even glimpse fleetingly the truth, we'll probably just go insane. Quote, the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance. Someday, the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. End quote. Now, the stories themselves aren't long, interconnected novels. They're short, fragmented, with different characters and locations, but all stitched together by similar moods and themes. There's a kind of aesthetic playbook, if you will, that Lovecraft pulls from, and honestly, it's so consistent that you could probably make one of those old starter pack memes out of it. So, what's in a Lovecraft story? Well, let's make our own, shall we? First, we need a vaguely academic protagonist, usually a scholar, archaeologist, or scientist who is probably rich. Then we need a family with secrets, and then a slow descent into madness. By the end, our rational, educated narrator is scribbling half-coherent warnings. Now, don't forget to add in a heavy dose of science or even pseudoscience, and last, for good measure, let's throw in some of Lovecraft's personal obsessions, including his love for New England and a huge fixation on architecture and history. Now, sometimes these are really interesting, especially if you're a fan of that period, but sometimes paragraphs and paragraphs describing buildings, which is like, okay, we get the point. Despite that, or because of it, it all feels distinctly American, rooted in old towns and forgotten histories, but with something alien lurking underneath. It's interesting how Lovecraft's aesthetic is so tied to this era of Americana, and how all of these elements of existential terror have become inseparable from his name, so much so that the genre itself is now called Lovecraftian. And this begs the question, who is Lovecraft? Well, Lovecraft was by all accounts an extremely imaginative, talented individual with an objectively awesome name and an objectively rough life. He came from an old, once wealthy New England family, but by the time he was born in 1890, things were already falling apart. His father died when he was young, his mother was overbearing and unstable, and he spent most of his childhood sick, isolated, and reading a lot. Now, you'll often see Lovecraft is often described as a total recluse, this pale ghost of a man hiding away in Providence, terrified of everything, but that picture is not entirely accurate. While he did live a fairly solitary life at times, friends and biographers close to him have pointed out that he actually traveled quite a bit and maintained a huge network of pen pals. But I think a lot of people like to imagine him as this total shut-in because it adds to this aura of mystique. But it's important to note that there's conflicting opinions on this. Anyway, after a stint in New York, which he famously hated with a burning passion, almost an obsession, he returned to Providence and hit his creative stride. We're talking about The Call of Cthulhu, the shadow over Innsmouth at the Mountains of Madness in quick succession. But despite writing what would later define an entire genre of horror, he never really saw any success in his lifetime. He died poor, sick, and mostly unknown in 1937, probably never imagining how wildly influential his work would eventually become. And the reason it would become as well known as it is because of Lovecraft's small but passionate circle of fellow writers and correspondents. One of them, August Derleth, was absolutely instrumental in keeping his legacy alive. After Lovecraft's death, Derleth preserved and published his stories. It's hard to overstate how much of Lovecraft's modern fame exists thanks to him. Now, of course, the spotlight doesn't just hit the good parts. And in Lovecraft's case, that means we have to address the obvious racism. Now, I am not going to beat it to death here since it's been discussed endlessly elsewhere, but yes, it is there and it is ugly. Lovecraft was an elitist and a racist, some even saying that his story echoed those fears through non-human races. But again, it's complicated a bit by the fact that he married a Jewish woman, and there are elements of his stories that look quite favorably on minorities. Either way, acknowledging it doesn't erase the huge creative influence his writing had on modern horror, and sure, different times, different standards. But if you do a little bit of digging, you'll find some extremely distasteful stuff, particularly in his poems. But it's not just the racism that's gotten criticism over the years. For such a famous writer, a lot of people have talked about his writing, even authors. A lot of this comes down to saying his dialogue is flat, his characters are paper thin, and his plots can feel very mechanical, which I think is totally fair. But I do think a lot of this boils down to taste, because on the other hand, when Lovecraft's writing lands, it really lands. Quote, "Madness rides the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses. Now, as the bane of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed web wings circle closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable." End quote. Good stuff, right? Now, personally, I think everyone has their superpowers, and Lovecraft's was his ability to set the atmosphere and tone, which in horror is probably one of the most important things. And you know, people can say his writing is bad all they want, but at the end of the day, there are very few authors in the world whose writing stands the test of time and continues to be relevant after almost a century, and Lovecraft has definitely been one of them. And speaking of that, what actually makes up Cthulhu? Well, my friend, it's an excellent question, and fittingly enough, one that doesn't really have a clear answer. The first problem you'll run into when trying to understand it is something that Lovecraft himself might have actually approved. The more you try to define it, the more it kind of slips through your fingers. You see, Lovecraft wasn't writing a neat, planned out series. He was writing in a completely different era when most of his stories appeared as short pieces in pulp magazines. They were loosely connected like we talked about before, but there was never anything like a master document tying it all together. But if you see mentions of the Necronomicon or Arkham, it's safe to say you're probably in the right neighborhood. That being said, there is a generally agreed upon core of stories written by Lovecraft himself, which are the ones that really define what we think of now as Cthulhu. These include, but are not limited to, the Dunwich Horror, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and of course, The Call of Cthulhu. As far as the reading order, sure, you could technically do it chronologically, but there's no real official reading order, since each story has its own characters, locations, and self-contained plots. If you want a solid starting point, just pick one of the greatest hits, The Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, and see if the mood clicks with you. From there, you can really just dive deeper at your own pace. If you want to go for completeness, the Complete Tales collection includes 23 of these stories, although you could easily argue at least several more fit the tone and spirit of them. Now, all of this sounds fairly straightforward until you start pulling on that tentacled thread. Because once you start including everything, meaning all the stories other authors have added since Lovecraft's time, things get wildly confusing on a few several levels. Now, scholars and fans have different systems for labeling the different phases, and people tend to divide it into two main ones, with stage 1 being the Lovecraft Circle and the original stories. This is the stuff that Lovecraft himself was writing, plus the early crossovers with his friends and contemporaries. So, during the last decade of Lovecraft's life, he formed a loose network of correspondence known as the Lovecraft Circle. These were fellow pulp writers he swapped letters, ideas, and sometimes story elements with. And these include huge names like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, the guy who gave us Conan the Barbarian. They all borrowed from each other in fun and quite interesting ways. So Howard might reference Lovecraft's infamous Necronomicon in a Conan story, but there weren't any hard agreed upon rules. But Clark Ashton Smith might be the most significant contributor to the original Cthulhu mythology, with some of his most notable stories being The Seven Geeses and The Coming of the White Worm. But again, Howard was an extremely close correspondent of Lovecraft, and it's kind of amazing how close they were, considering Conan and Cthulhu could not be more different. Now, if you're curious about all of these, I'll actually link an entire page from the incredible resource, the Cthulhu Files website, that lists all the writings from this first generation. But the second stage really began after Lovecraft's death, when Derleth took it upon himself to preserve and expand Lovecraft's stories. Derleth not only co-founded Arkham House to publish Lovecraft's work, but also coined the term Cthulhu Mythos to describe this emerging shared universe, which, by the way, Lovecraft himself probably wouldn't have even called it. After all, he jokingly referred to it as Yog Sothory, which is arguably more catchy. Now, importantly and controversially, Derleth didn't just preserve, he actually reinterpreted. His version was far more structured and moralized than Lovecraft's. He divided the cosmic entities into opposing factions and more of a good versus evil vibe. Lovecraft's own cosmology, by contrast, was way less organized. His gods weren't part of a moral war, they were indifferent, alien, and incomprehensible. And some fans resented Derleth for this. But regardless of being true to Lovecraft's vision or not, Derleth is the reason that Lovecraft is known today, so thank you for that. Now, some fans and scholars sometimes talk about a third or even fourth stage, including everything from the tabletop RPGs like Call of Cthulhu to films, comics, and video games inspired by Lovecraftian horror, which brings us nicely to the many, and I mean many adaptations of Cthulhu, because the books are just one small part of the puzzle. But we're running into a similar problem here, because much like trying to define what actually counts as a Cthulhu story, figuring out what qualifies as a Cthulhu adaptation is kind of a lost cause. Sure, you'll find plenty of wikis and databases that try, but the problem is that there's a huge difference between something that is a direct adaptation and something that is merely inspired by. When does a piece of media stop being a homage and start being a true adaptation? If there's a giant squid-like creature lurking underwater, does that automatically make it a Cthulhu adaptation? Regardless, when it comes to TV and film, this is probably where Cthulhu has made the biggest splash. Which is interesting because over the years, people have called Lovecraft unfilmable. His stories rely on implication, insanity, and stuff that you can't really describe, so how do you film that? That said, there are some straightforward, honest-to-goodness adaptations out there, but since Cthulhu is in the public domain, there has been so many that it's basically impossible, and honestly not that fun, to list every single one. Instead, think of this more as a sampler platter. In the 60s, we got The Haunted Place, based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward, and it has some delicious atmosphere and shots. In the 70s, we got the Dunwich Horror, a kind of campy but really fun adaptation. Very zany vibes, but the visuals are incredible. It's not exactly terrifying, but it's definitely worth a watch. It's a super unique film. In the 90s, we got The Resurrected in 1991, which is one of the more faithful adaptations of the case of Charles Dexter Ward. And in 1992, we got one of my personal favorites, and sorry for any mispronunciation here, but Insumi o Ukagi, a Japanese adaptation of Shadow over Innsmouth, and it's probably the reason I love Cthulhu. It's like almost a random generator of genre mashup. Basically, imagine a mix of 90s Japan and Lovecraft, and whatever is in your imagination right now is probably exactly it. It's on YouTube if you're curious. In the 2000s, we got Dagon in 2001 and The Shunned House in 2003, which is a lesser-known Italian adaptation. The Call of Cthulhu in 2005 is probably one of the most notable ones. It's made by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, and it's a silent film stylized like a 1920s movie, as it would have been in Lovecraft's time. It absolutely nails the vibe from what I could see, but I wasn't really able to find it to watch anywhere. And if anyone knows where to watch it, please tell me so I can link it in the description. In 2005, we got Dreams in the Witch House, and in 2007, we got Cthulhu, a modernized and very loose reimagining of the Shadow over Innsmouth. It swaps out literal monsters for emotional ones, following a gay man returning to his eerie hometown. We also got another Japanese one with the Dunwich Horror and Other Stories in 2007, which is claymation that's surprisingly terrifying in its own way. Also not really an adaptation, but too fun not to mention Call Girl of Cthulhu in 2014, about a call girl that turns out to be the chosen bride of Cthulhu. Probably the most well-known, at least recently, is The Color Out of Space in 2019, starring none other than Nicolas Cage. It's visually stunning, completely unhinged in a great way, and a really good film for what it is. In the 2020s, we got Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, featuring 2 direct Lovecraft adaptations, Pickman's Model and Dreams in the Witch House. And speaking of Del Toro, we almost got his long-planned adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness. He had a full script, Tom Cruise was attached, but the studio pulled the plug, which is a real shame. Also, an honorable and or questionable mention is Lovecraft County in 2020, HBO's strange mix of racial history, pulp horror, and cosmic dread. It only ran for 1 season before being canceled, probably because it seemed like a very confusing mashup of different things. But when it comes to Cthulhu adaptations, probably a good chunk of people know them, at least recently, because of video games. And again, it's tricky. I can already hear at least 50 people in the comments foaming at the mouth to say Bloodborne, and that is fair. But again, I want to talk about honest-to-goodness adaptations first. Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is loosely based on The Shadow over Innsmouth. Now, it's ambitious, sure, janky, sure, but deeply atmospheric. The shooting mechanics are a bit dated, but the sense of creeping dread is unmatched and fits the vibe of the story. Now, channels like Mandalore Gaming have already done deep dives on it, so I won't beat the dead deep ones too much, but suffice to say that this was one of the earliest, most complete attempts to bring Lovecraftian horror into modern gaming, and did a surprisingly admirable job. Then there was Call of Cthulhu in 2018, which was a detective horror game that directly adapts the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, complete with sanity mechanics and occult investigations. It's a little rough around the edges, but it really nails that paranoid feeling. Also in 2018, we got Dusk, which was a retro-style first-person shooter. Basically, imagine Cthulhu plus Quake. Then in 2019, The Sinking City, a open-world detective adventure set in a flooded New England city with a ton of Cthulhu elements and beats in it. Again, it was a bit buggy, sure, it was a AA game, but it absolutely oozes atmosphere. I genuinely had a blast playing this and soaking in the oppressive tone. 2019, we got Stygian Reign of the Old Ones, which was a turn-based combat set in Arkham, but really there has just been every type of game imaginable, including some straight-up bizarre mashups. You want a turn-based tactics Cthulhu game? No problem, here you go with Cthulhu Tactics in 2018. What about an indie RPG? No problem, we got that with Cthulhu Saves the World and its prequel, I kid you not, Cthulhu Saves Christmas in 2019. And last but not least is Tesla vs. Lovecraft in 2018, where you play as Tesla battling Lovecraft and his army of monsters. But of course, we cannot talk about Cthulhu adaptations without mentioning one of the big daddies of them all, and arguably one of the main reasons Lovecraft's work has stayed alive in modern pop culture, and I am of course talking about the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG. It is hard to overstate how pivotal this was in bringing Cthulhu to a broader audience. Originally released in 1981, it's become one of the most influential and award-winning RPGs ever made, and it's a total departure from the usual power fantasy templates of games like D&D. For example, combat is a last resort and usually a fatal one. The real challenge lies in solving mysteries, maintaining sanity, and making it out alive. It's now in its 7th edition with countless supplements, expansions, and spin-offs. Honestly, this game could and should get its own video. There is so much history to cover and has its own lores and stories, and pretty much just become its own thing in its own right. There's also been a slew of board and card games. We got Arkham Horror in 2005, which was a cooperative adventure, and also Arkham Horror the card game, which reimagines everything as a deck building experience. But honestly, there are so many Cthulhu-themed board games, it's almost absurd. If you search Cthulhu on Board Game Geek, you will find literally hundreds of options. And even outside of that, don't think for a second we are done, because Cthulhu has slithered his way into every medium imaginable, up to and including comic strips. And I kid you not, there is even a Cthulhu-themed anime, reimagining Lovecraft's cosmic horrors as cute anime girls. So Cthulhu is now our waifu. What a time to be alive. Beyond that, there have been quite a few genuinely solid graphic novel adaptations over the years. Boom Studio has done several good ones, and there's been others from Xenoscope, Millennium Productions, and even IDW. The comics by Alan Moore in particular are great. And again, this is just scratching the surface. Once you start counting everything inspired by Cthulhu, the list becomes practically endless, especially depending on how you want to define inspired. If you're going by sheer influence, it's everywhere. Movies like The Mist, The Thing, games like Bloodborne, which arguably did more to reignite Lovecraftian horror in recent years than almost anything else, and other titles like Darkest Dungeon or Eternal Darkness all carry the same DNA. Music, theater, visual arts are overflowing with Lovecraftian inspirations. Bands, painters, you name it, everyone's borrowed from the Cosmic Horror Toolkit, and if you start looking for it, it's everywhere. There's even a video on YouTube I saw where someone's tried to say that Teletubbies is inspired by Lovecraft and Cthulhu, which, LOL. So, with that in mind, we have to ask, what does the future of Cthulhu actually look like? Well, obviously there are not going to be any new Lovecraft books. The man is dead, spoilers, I know, but the mythology he created has long since grown past him, and I think you could easily argue that Cthulhu has never been more widespread in popular culture than it is now. And a big part of that is that, well, it's in public domain, and the public has certainly made it their domain. We're still getting modern Cthulhu books, games, comics, and movies all the time, like Worshippers of Cthulhu, a Lovecraftian city builder, which these genre mashups are just getting insane, and I love it. Romance novels are getting in on it too, including Secrets and Sacrifices, a Regency Cthulhu novel in 2024, okay. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is that Cthulhu isn't just alive and well, it's multiplying. For better or worse, Cthulhu has gone mainstream. He's in bookstores, memes, video games, probably printed on a t-shirt near you right now. He's even made it into politics, running as a parody candidate in multiple elections. And in science, he's got spiders, moths, and even microorganisms named after him. And you can really see this explosion reflected in the fandom. It's ridiculously dedicated and large. There's an insane amount of beautiful fan art of every type imaginable from artists all over the world. You've got massive wikis, entire databases like CthulhuFiles.com and HPLovecraft.com as well. There are thriving Reddit communities for every corner of Cthulhu, from literary discussions to tabletop RPG scenes, and speaking of that, the Call of Cthulhu TTRPG still has a huge active player base with its own dedicated sites. What's kind of beautiful about all of this is how interconnected it's all become. People stumble into Cthulhu from completely different directions, maybe through Bloodborne, maybe through the TTRPG, and suddenly they find this massive web of stories, art, and other fans waiting for them. Not to mention the huge amount of public projects out there, which I'm not sure if this counts, but one of my favorites has to be on YouTube, which huge shout out to Horror Babble, which did an excellent audio narration of almost all the stories. And so, with its proliferation in the popular zeitgeist, it's kind of fascinating to think that this one guy living in poverty somehow had his bizarre ideas turned into something this huge. For better or worse, it's been popularized, commercialized, and turned into profit. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that the titan Cthulhu has become is probably very far removed from what its creator ever could have imagined or possibly even wanted. Now, not to get too much on my high horse, but I think this is a great example of how creators don't really get to choose what they're remembered for. Popular sentiment decides that for them, and whether the creator's vision or the public's vision is the right one, that's a whole other debate worth having. But regardless, for whatever reason, this strange vision of alien gods and cosmic horror has only grown more popular over the years and most likely will continue to do so. And the question is why? Well, I think one huge reason is that it's basically open source. Lovecraft built a world other creators could borrow and expand upon, and they've been doing it ever since. In novels, movies, video games, it's all just extremely pliable. And of course, the imagery helps. Giant tentacle gods, sunken cities, twisted 1920s Americana. It's pretty iconic, right? But maybe the biggest reason it endures is the core idea of cosmic and existential horror tapping into something primal in all of us. Lovecraft's fear of the unknown is at its heart a fear we all share. For better or worse, Cthulhu has become the face of that fear. So, in conclusion, try your best to steer clear of Innsmouth, or better yet, the ocean entirely. And if you absolutely must join a cult, well, make sure it's for Cthulhu. Thank you so much for watching. I want to give an enormous shout out to Matisse for helping me fact check and bouncing ideas off of. I also want to give an enormous shout out to the Lovecraft Reddit, which has been extraordinarily helpful when making this video, and for all the people on there who helped me bounce ideas off of. As always, no shout out is ever complete without talking about my patrons. Thank you for keeping the channel alive and running. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out my link in the description below. As always, if you ever want to suggest anything for me to cover next, please drop a comment and let me know. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day and a great Halloween, and I'll see you next time. Bye.